For this discussion first, the live stream, I will be putting up the my Patreon first, so people can see it. If they want to donate, they have the option to donate. If not, they don't have to. But you can go to the website that you'll see there, or the discussion or the description at the bottom of the page. You'll see that there. We'll also discuss two specific areas on this. When you see the MMT at the top, you'll see that's on this discussion for today. That means modern monetary theory. But before we get to that, we're going to go under why it's not anti-Semitic to not support Israel. Now, what we need to understand with this is what the idea of Semitism is. Now, first of all, to be Semitic with it, this even gets areas of a lot of Africa, certain areas of Asia. This gets a lot of areas of the Arabic people within it. Even goes down to areas like Somalia. So accusing someone like Ilhan Omar of being anti-Semitic, which is kind of laughable, because she would technically be Semitic. That would essentially be going against her own self-interest of acting anti-Semitic is quite laughable. Now, when it comes down to it, is that would not what this is why being against Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, because now we need to go into when Israel came in existence, and what if you actually do a basic search, you're going to find out that Israel did not come into existence after the it did not come into existence at the certain time of when people thought that it did, which is after the World War II, when it actually did come into existence. You're going to find out is that the problem is that it comes into existence in actually after the Treaty of Versailles was when it was actually formed. Now, this is actually well before, and this is actually what happened was you have you have a person, you have basically where people from the British Empire were actually put down there, and what was happening was that this was actually put down there after World War I, and this was going down there well before. And this was something that was essentially done specifically for the point of getting rid of the Jewish people. And this was done there as the whole idea was essentially to get rid of the Jewish immigrants that were coming through in the areas such as Whitechapel. And you'll notice a lot of even just studying on the idea of Jack the Ripper, you'll actually notice that there's a lot of racism against Jews in the coming from Eastern Europe, even within that case alone, that they tried to pin the case against those Eastern European Jews, and didn't even look at it really seriously. So when we're talking about why it's not anti-Semitic to not support Israel, we're talking the excuses of stating that it's that it was that it goes back down to, oh, you're against you don't believe in the Holocaust and all these other things. But well, the fact is when we start to look at the actual history, is it's not so clear cut of who these people are. Even when you start to look at the actual society, is where these actual people are mixed with, is we're not talking that it might be a majority Jewish, but where these people are coming from are not necessarily from those areas that are naturally Semitic. A lot of these people are actually coming from outside the realm, and that's the whole problem. Is to technically be Semitic, you essentially have to be from the actual region, and you have to be actually, your full bloodline has to be from that region itself. You cannot be of European descent. You cannot be of like basically any other type of descent of like South American or East Asian or any of these other areas, or from the Caucasus areas such as like Russia or other areas like that. You actually have to be from the actual you actually have to be from the actual region itself to technically be listed as Semitic. And this is what we did list as how you become a Semitic language, which is what becomes Semitic. And where the actual defense why they actually force these ideas is because there's a lot of money that goes into this alliance between the U.S. and Israel. Now, people tend to say that pointing this out is anti-Semitic alone. Now, I do have Jewish relatives on my dad's side, so this is not me just trying to basically come up with some type of theory that doesn't make any sense. Now, you're going to find it's from the major, two of the major groups that basically do a lot of this funding is AIPAC is one and CARE is another. Now, this is not just trying to rail on Israel. This is also railing on a Sunni Islamic group, which is CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Both of these groups are essentially guilty. Now, when people go against Ilhan Omar, well, Ilhan Omar is essentially being biased. She's essentially going after one of these groups that's basically funneling in a lot of money into Congress, but not going after the other. So she's being very, very dishonest when it comes down to that. Now, if she's going to be honest about these lobbying groups that are essentially wanting to funnel in a lot of money, she can't exactly say, oh, we're going to rail against AIPAC, but then 1 week later I'm going to do a speech for CARE. Well, you can't do that, because what you're doing is you're showing that you're biased, and you're doing this for strictly on the guise of religion. It doesn't show an actual honesty to your cause. Now, if you're looking to get foreign influence out of the actual system and want an actual system that's going to protect its own natural sovereign interests, you should essentially be going after both groups. These are two major groups that actually do this. Other countries tend to be lower on, other forms tend to be lower on the list. But basically where a lot of this money comes from that goes out is to Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE are tending to essentially suck the system dry. People can say about, well, what about Russia or Ukraine or something like that? Those are actually very, very small things with it that almost have no implication. They're small fish in the pond. When it comes to the big fish, those are the ones that if you look at where our money's going out, that's where our money's going out to. And you see that we're essentially subsidizing their oil. What we're doing is we're basically subsidizing their militaries. We're paying for virtually everything that they need, and we're the suckers on board along with a lot of other Western countries. and this is what's happening. And so and this is why we say it's not anti-Semitic not to support Israel. It's basically Israel should be viewed as any other country, and basically the actual support is based on what their actual policy is, and is it beneficial to the actual nation. And what we need to view here is that it's not. The actual nation of Israel does not, even beyond looking at we should not have entangled alliances, even throwing that to the wind of the actual statement of our founders, when we start to look at it, is are they beneficial to us from an actual ally itself with it if we look at it? And the answer is no. They do not do anything for us positively. They've essentially take money from our budget and give us nothing back. They basically do nothing for us for intelligence. They've given us bad intelligence when it comes down to us for from a trade. There's nothing that they offer us that we cannot produce at a lower price at our own country. Because of the actual cost, people are going to mention, oh, but they've developed cures for things, or they just launched a rocket recently. Well, the fact is that that's fully at the cost of the United States taxpayer, and that's what's happening. And so essentially, it's just us fitting the bill for their work, and we could essentially solve the whole problem by hiring their people, and we could easily do that, and that would solve the whole issue. And you don't need to essentially subsidize. It takes a lot less money to hire people, so we could do it for basically a fraction of the cost, and you don't need to be allied with a country to hire people. It's just a basic simple immigration policy. And we've brought in immigrants from plenty of countries. It does not necessarily mean we're an ally with them. We've brought in positive immigrants from even dangerous countries that have actually been beneficial to our economy, that have actually been very brilliant minds. So that doesn't mean that you have to be an actual ally. When it comes to their economy, they've essentially supported the ideas of socialism. They're just essentially taking their funds from other countries. Well, essentially, we're a capitalist country. They're essentially a parliamentary system. We're a democratic republic. Essentially, they're more aligned with Britain than they are with America. So basically, they're not even government-wise, they're not even aligned with the United States. They're not a democratic republic. I mean, there's other countries that are more closely aligned with. I mean, we have the Philippines that have a democratic republic, yet we do not consider them as closely of an ally as we do with Israel. And there's really no legitimate reason, yet the Philippines have the exact same government as we do. They're a democratic republic that actually bases their constitution on our constitution. Frankly, they were formerly part of the United States itself before we granted them their own independence. That should give you a real big clue. Israel was granted independence from Great Britain. There's no links between the two countries of the U.S. and Israel. There's really beyond them basically lobbying for a lot of money. There should be no legitimate reason, and this is why when people say they don't support Israel, there's no reason to basically make the argument against it. Now, you could make an argument that someone is not consistent, by saying that there will, when it comes to dealing with major lobbying groups, by saying that they're willing to go on the other go with CARE and speak a week later after trashing AIPAC, and when they should be trashing both groups, because both groups are destructive to our system, and both groups have a very, very big negative force on it. And this is what needs to be looked at. So, I mean, you can state that, but you cannot state anything on the idea of trying to say it's anti-Semitic not to support them. No, this is actually, we have this thing called free speech. You can state anything you want with it. There's no specific link to any specific country. I mean, you can, well, what about when we consider, let's say, Iran? Is it Islamophobic to put sanctions on Iran? Well, we've been doing it for quite a few years now, and essentially they've complied with this nuclear deal. They've also have never been a state sponsor of terror. They're actual groups that have aligned, the Shia groups that have been aligned have only been filling in the gaps that essentially intervention has caused huge problems with. When we look at the actual terrorist groups, we see that they're Sunni, which means that they come from areas of Saudi Arabia and UAE funding, and that those are your sources of terrorism, and that those are the ones we should be looking at for larger state sponsors of terrorism, which is why Saudi Arabia is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. So when it comes down to it, this is why CARE has been busted, because CARE is linked with Saudi Arabia. Why CARE has been busted for links for terrorism. And we see that Israel has even linked itself with Saudi Arabia and doesn't care with the links to terrorism. They really do not care what goes on with that. And when we're looking at that, it shows that even with their statements, they've even had statements that say that they'd rather have ISIS than Iran. Well, that shows that they have support for a terrorist group. Well, that should be even grounds for any person who is sane to say that they do not support Israel. Is that anti-Semitic? No, that's self-preservation. If you do not support terrorism, that would say that you have grounds to not support Israel. Supporting terrorism would essentially be support for Israel, because just within that grounds, they stated that they would rather have ISIS than Iran. One would state that they would, a healthy statement would say they would rather have Iran, who is not a terrorist group, than ISIS. That's just plain old English and plain basic logic. Now, when we look at the idea of, we'll go into the next part, which is Bernie Sanders' advisor bringing on the idea of modern monetary theory. Now, this advisor was initially from 2016, but he's still embraced this idea, and this idea is essentially taking over a lot of the Democratic Party. Now, what exactly is modern monetary theory? This is basically, essentially, removing the idea that spending is actually a concern. Essentially, the debt no longer becomes a concern. You can print as much money, and you can print your way out of issues. The thing is it ignores the idea of inflation. Inflation is no longer an issue. It ignores the idea of international trade with currency and debt holdings, which is a major issue. This is why this has never been used by any country to date. Even when we're talking, even full-out socialist regimes do not use this. They usually use a Keynesian model. And there's a reason why, because they understand that their currency has to be traded with other nations. Even if they go with a fiat currency, that's going to be raised with massive inflation. They understand that there is a thing called inflation. They do understand that. This is even in Venezuela. Venezuela has not, which is essentially a socialist nation, they have not even adopted a modern monetary theory even in their current state. Now, theoretically, if the modern monetary theory were beneficial, and if it were able to get you out of a lot of trouble, and essentially get everything that they would ever want and desire, that they would essentially have gone for this a long time ago, and that they wouldn't have worried about their debts and done deals with China and Russia to essentially trade off gold to essentially buy off their debt. Now, since we know that they have not done gone for this, we know that there is something clearly wrong with this. And the reason why is because it ignores the actual international implications of this. And we need to understand what this actually means. It ignores the ideas of inflation, and it ignores the actual just massive implications that are actually already happening with even just Keynesian economics. Now, Keynesian economics is even called the modern monetary theory crazy. And when we actually look at the output of the Keynesian economics, we can see that basically when they push for their thing, they push for certain outcomes such as higher employment, and they'll use higher employment by pushing with interest rates to get higher employment and desired interest rates, or desired interest rates to get desired and screwing around with the interest rates to get desired inflation rates, which they figure there's certain key rates with inflation per year. Now, when it comes down to it, is we see that those essentially, even with that central planning, that even that doesn't work, and these are ones that are essentially used by progressives and neoconservatives alike. And what does it mean with these socialists, with these new socialists in Western countries who want to use this modern monetary theory? Well, if that's being called crazy by these people who essentially use this system that essentially is broken, of the Keynesian economics, that's essentially can't even have their desired results and have had regular breakdowns. When you essentially start trying to print your way out of trouble and ignore the implications of debts and inflation, what ends up causing it is now you have nobody to buy up that debt. Well, you don't just owe yourself that money. This is a thing with it, that they think that essentially that the government is the creator of that money, and the government's the ultimate source of it. They don't realize that somebody has to buy up that debt. That doesn't come from nowhere. This means that essentially that they have no idea what they're doing when it comes to that economic theory. And when you have nothing there, essentially what's the only solution would be essentially a hyperinflation. And that's the only thing that can happen, which means that if no one's going to buy up the debt, you essentially have to print more to pay for it. Essentially, you're trying to use your own currency to buy off your own debt, your previous debt. And what you're doing is you're essentially trying to recycle your own money. And this is what ends up happening. Now, what this would do is essentially create a massive problem. This means that things get a lot costlier, that people are going to have a very, very hard time living under a system like this, because you have this hyperinflation which is completely out of control, because each year the debt is going to essentially climb, and there's going to be no people responsible for it. We see what happens under the Keynesian system, where it's climbed even in moderate amounts, and we see what happens with the economy, that the economy is not exactly growing at rates that it could because of the fact of the debt sitting there as a huge weight on it. And we know that it could grow at rapid rates like it has in the past if the debt wasn't sitting there weighing it down from government spending. And this is just a fact. And if we went, this is what's known by Austrian economists, and from their system they see a complete different outcome, which is even more drastic on the modern monetary theory. That basically not only are they trying to essentially view the failures of the Keynesian system, which is completely utter nonsense, they're trying to take nonsense and put it up to the infinite level. And this is just basically insanity. So what you're trying to do, you're trying to basically add more and more debt, and you're not even essentially being responsible for the debt because no one's going to monetize it now. And essentially you're going to isolate your own country because no one's going to buy up the debt, because the only way you can essentially buy up the debt is to essentially start trading off land and goods that essentially aren't yours. The only way to do that is to essentially steal people's property. And that's the only solution. Essentially, you have a whole big country of slaves then. That essentially, they're not even slaves to the government anymore. They're slaves to these other nations that essentially have purchased vested interests. Because you've essentially run the debt up so high that is well into the hundreds of trillions of dollars, not including future liabilities, because the future liabilities are currently well over 100 trillion in the current system, but you essentially run the current system well over within a few years well over 100 trillion, and that's not hard to do when you start adding a huge bucket list of things that you want. And then, frankly, with it, there's going to be then, with this modern monetary theory of why pay taxes? Because if you can just basically say, hey, we're not going to pay for this bill of goods, what's the point of taxes? I mean, you might as well say there's no taxation anymore, not even for businesses, because frankly, there's no legitimate reason for any of that as well, because you might as well say we're just going to print everything. And use this massive inflation to do it, because you're going to have hyperinflation. You might as well not charge people for it. And this is where modern monetary theory is complete garbage, because they don't even think about anything, and it's just basically produced with people who have complete lack of brain power to even have any type of ability to have common sense, understanding that it is a global marketplace, that people buy up debt. That debt isn't just this thing that a country owes itself. That debt is actually something that people buy up. These are actually loans. Just like when you get a car loan, you don't owe the car loan to yourself. You owe that to someone else. And that's the same thing as a government. When a government takes on debt, it creates these debt bonds. Well, these debt bonds are purchased by other people. It can be purchased by people within the nation. It can be purchased by foreign nations, but it's only going to have these debt bonds purchased if there's actually a value in purchasing them. The moment that you essentially are being completely irresponsible and start racking up more debt than much more debt than you're actually bringing in revenue, they're going to say, nope, not going to happen anymore. We're not buying any more debt bonds. This means nobody's going to purchase them anymore, and that's when the actual government will shut down, because you don't have this actual ability to raise the debt, because you need this to actually come through, because otherwise they're going to say there's no ability to get more loans. You'll essentially be cut off, and that's what happens, and that's why you can't do a modern monetary theory, because they will cut you off. And they're going to say, nope, we don't care what you say that you're this large nation. We're cutting you, or that you have the world reserve currency. We're cutting you off of your loans because you're asking for more money than you actually bring in each year. And we cannot do that in debt. And that's just because that's considered just acting completely rational. If you're asking for a program that's going to basically that's going to be asking for 3 times the debt than you actually bring in revenue, they're not going to do it, because that's what our current system does. Even when you start to, even if you're going to say, oh, we're going to tax the top 0.1% at these, let's say 100%, that's not going to bring anything in that would actually cause any dent to the to your programs. They would barely even touch it. What would the only way you would actually be able to break even is to actually tax people at 100% making $30,000 or more. And I don't think you want to exactly announce that. That's just paying for the Green New Deal. If you do anything else other than that, you're talking that basically that's going to add even more. And you wouldn't have much more than that to go. Because frankly, you're talking taxing people making $0 and up and taking all of their money away. And essentially having people work for free. And I don't think people are likely to work for free. I don't think you're going to exactly get every person in this country work for free. That's not exactly what the country is built on. And that's why when we're talking about the modern monetary theory, it's essentially built on complete and utter nonsense. This basically, the thing that reminds me of is when Homer Simpson in The Simpsons became the sanitation commissioner of Springfield, and he was trying to get the work, because he spent so much money, he was trying to get the workers to work for no money. And when they said no, that they're not going to, he realized that he had a huge problem. And that's exactly what the modern monetary theory is. Essentially, it works on complete and utter nonsense, and when they realize that that can't work, essentially they're going to realize that they're going to have to get people making $30,000 and up just to support this thing to work for no money. And when people tell them, no, we're not going to, they're going to realize that this thing is never going to pass. That's why people like Nancy Pelosi said, I'm never letting this thing see the light of day. That's why people like Mitch McConnell said, sure, I'm going to bring this thing out. And why people like Chuck Schumer are saying, oh, you're doing this as a political ploy. Sure, Mitch McConnell's doing the thing as a political ploy. He wants to show how stupid the party is. He wants to show how basically stupid Crazy Eyes from New York is, that she wants to actually do something like this, and seeing that the actual majority of the people on the Democratic side actually support this garbage and this nonsense, are actually going for it, that there's only maybe a couple of people who are actually kind of skeptical on it, and only one person who's actually has a decent idea on foreign policy, being Tulsi Gabbard. That's basically, they only have one person out there that would actually be a legitimate candidate. But since we have Crazy Town out there, we're talking that basically it's likely that they're going to go after one of these crazy people. So the Democrats have no shot of winning. And this has been pointed out by Reason TV. People with it, they've already said that Trump has already won the 2020 election. Because the fact is they've already gone off the deep end, embracing things that basically are complete and utter insanity. And I think this is very, very important to understand. And when we start to look at it, we need to understand this, that if they actually want to do something as Democrats, I'm not talking partisan in either way, but we're talking that they need to get back to reality. They need to even dump Keynesian economics. They need to start learning what the Austrian school is actually about, and start learning that basically you have to be fiscal hawks when it comes down to things, and you're going to have to start cutting a lot of things and try out the idea of let all spending expire and only reauthorize the spending that can reach the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of spending go. And you're going to just go bill by, you're just going to go spending bill by spending bill. It'll take about a couple of weeks. People are going to be mad, but you're going to get rid of a lot of stuff. Then what you're going to do is you're going to basically, you might want to actually take a look at the Constitution. You're going to go through with it, and you're going to go look through, and you're going to see anything that's basically not even a constitutional department, and you're just going to start wiping those out, such as the Department of Education, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, all these other things with it, Department of Education. You're just going to wipe them all out. You're going to get down to basically only having a constitutional government. And you're going to realize with it that people are going to be a lot happier. And you're going to realize when people don't have this system bogging them down, that they're going to be a lot happier with their lives. Because what causes unhappiness in these people is that they have a government looming over their head. And you look at all these things that essentially what the Ferguson riot was about was a government looming over them, trying to essentially fine them for every little thing. Now you look at, now you can have communities with multiple racial backgrounds and not have high crime. It's very easy. You eliminate the war on drugs, which is unconstitutional. You start actually going down to a minimalist government. And it's not hard. And the fact is you're going to have to start studying some of the ideas of being pro-liberty, which means you're going to have to start eliminating a lot of this big spending ideas, because there's multiple ways to approach problems. And what they're going to have to realize is that people don't need to be taken care of cradle to grave. People's best option is going to be being able to make their own decisions. The more freedom they have, the happier they will be. And this is what to do with it. And the more government intrusion you have, the more miserable people are. If you just look at state by state, you're gonna notice that for the happiness quotient, state by state, you're gonna notice the happier states are the states with less regulation. And that's when states do these things, you're going to notice that. So when you start to bring in these ideas of this modern monetary theory and these just more government regulation, more government rules, you're going to make it a lot worse. What you need to do is start living by more liberty, and this is the whole point. And when people start doing that, you're going to see that the outcome is going to be a lot better for people. And that should be the ultimate goal. And when we're talking about their concerns, oh, people need to have a living wage. Well, the whole problem that actually caused this in the first place is the actual centralization of banking and the finance. This essentially took like 96 to 97% of the value of the United States dollar out of the hands of people and put it into the banking and financial industry through inflation. And when we look at that, that's the actual issue. If we want to solve the problem, we need to first do a full intrusive audit, which the Federal Reserve Bank actually tries to lobby against, number one. And number two, we need to essentially end the Federal Reserve Bank. Do an actual end of the system and do an amendment to do this. And this is something that I think that both sides can get under. The people who want more freedom on the right side and the people on the left side that actually want to end income inequality. And I think they can come under the same ideas. Now, people like Bernie Sanders that have been talking about income inequality, there's nothing that creates more income inequality than that. And when we're talking about there's more income inequality is created when we actually have these systems that are that when you start raising the minimum wage. If you notice, when you raise the minimum wage, these people are digging a bigger hole. we've seen more inequality the more the minimum wage goes up, and there's a reason why. We look back at the history of the minimum wage. It was meant actually to bring minorities down by actually creating a bigger barrier. It doesn't actually raise the actual wage of people. It actually creates a barrier of entry, and that's the only point. And it was created by unions that were led mostly by whites in the North to keep the blacks in the South from actually gaining the jobs they needed to get to actually make a wage. What they would do is blacks in the South would come up north and they would offer to work for less, and in order to block this, the unions of the North would actually say, we want to establish a minimum wage. So it would essentially create these laws that would block them from getting jobs, because essentially it would outprice them from the market. And they would set prevailing wage laws and these other things like this that would essentially block them from getting work. And that's what ended up happening. So then these blacks coming up north couldn't get work. Now when we look at it, is that was what was happening. So in the end, these blacks were getting the short end of the stick. And when these unions try to say, oh, we've always worked on the side of getting minorities help, and we've always been on the side of minorities. No, they've essentially been the enemy of the minorities, and that's been their history, and you can't deny that. And this is their actual history in the United States, and they've been linked since the progressives. You can't really deny the facts. Now, when it comes down to it, is if you want to actually start ending this, it would be ending a lot of these barriers, such as ending minimum wage. I mean, people are fully capable of making their own negotiations. What we want is more power for the people, less power for the bureaucrats in government. We don't want basically to say, well, you can't work for any less than this. We want people to say, you're free to negotiate for whatever price you want to work for. If you want to work for a penny an hour, fine, work for a penny an hour. If you think your skills are worth $30 an hour, negotiate to work for $30 an hour. But if you can't work for it, you're going to have to negotiate at a price that you can work at. And that's how things need to work, and that's where you get a difference. Now, what's going to happen is if you eliminate this, and if you eliminate these barriers, you're going to get more people hired. You're going to also, and then people will necessarily raise up, because now there's a lower risk for hiring people. There's also what ends up happening because of you doing this, and you're reducing these regulations, is you end up creating a system to where eventually you're going to have lower overhead, and it eventually is going to cause a deflation on the price of goods, because goods are necessarily going to cost less regulation. Thus, it goes back to as long as government does not intervene to raise the price of goods, which it should not, because that's not the job of government, as you get the government out of the price of setting the price of goods. What will happen is it'll deflate the price of goods, which means you can actually afford more things with your dollar. Thus, when we deflate the actual dollar itself, instead of inflating it, which is bad, we end up getting the benefits of the average consumer being able to buy more things. When the consumer buys more things, it helps stimulate the economy. And you only stimulate the economy not by handing out more money, but by the money actually having more value. Money has more value when the actual money is deflated, not by inflating it. Inflating it just basically says we're going to make things cost more. And this is where Keynesians feel that they can force people to buy things faster. They think that's a way to stimulate the economy. It doesn't. It basically just pulls people away from buying things totally, and they might buy things even later. you can't essentially force people to buy things at certain times. It doesn't work that way. You need to understand that people are going to buy things when they're going to buy things, and a lot of times it's based on the prices they can afford. And you can't force people based on what ends up happening on the actual price it's at. And if you want people to essentially afford things, you need, and stimulate the economy, you need to have a deflation, which means you can't keep inflating prices. When you have a deflation of the dollar, it doesn't necessarily mean people are going to wait. People are not going to wait. You look at what happens when you release the new Apple products. They're not out there with it because of the fact of inflating prices. They're out there because they go, hey, Apple released this new product, so I want it. People don't wait out there because of it. This is why the people out there don't understand when it comes to these centralist planners. They don't understand how the economy works. The market knows better. This is why we go to the idea of the Austrian economic school theory that basically tends to view the idea of the market controlling everything and going on the idea of the psychology of the market, and that you don't have central planners because central planners would only upset that. And modern monetary theory still goes in the idea of central planning, because essentially you would still need that because they need to decide how much more money to print, and the same idea with it goes in the same problems as the Keynesian system. So essentially you're just adding on to the same problems that we're currently having. Now if you want to fix the problem, you need to go in the opposite direction, which means don't keep spending so much money. You need to go in the opposite direction and spend a lot less money and go into the idea of understanding that the market controls it. When you go with the idea of the market controls the money, what's going to happen is you're going to have a very, very smooth business cycle. And this is what needs to be understood. And when you start doing this is you get rid of the problems. Modern monetary theory in the end with it just creates a much larger problem and doesn't even have any of these safety protocols that you find in the Keynesian school that at least they were at least smart enough to put in, that they knew that they couldn't ignore. And that's the whole problem. And I think that what we're talking about that is that you can't ignore the fact of the modern monetary theory on that level, that it's totally negating that, and it's basically running an economy on unicorn farts. And sorry to kind of like talk like that, but that's what it's doing. You're basically removing every bit of data that you would need, and you're basically saying that you can do whatever you want, just as long as you're handing free stuff out to people. And that's basically what it states. And it goes completely against any type of logic. And that's the whole point. Now if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and share it all the way around social media, and I'll be posting the my podcast probably in a little bit, because it's probably done with all of its other work that I need to do with it right after this. And that's about it. Make sure you donate to the Patreon if you're interested, and share and tell people about my Patreon account as well. That's either going to be in the chat or it's going to be right down below. And that's it, everybody. Bye.